Hello there, it's Andy Parks from the Washington Times, and I'll be joined by Stephen Dinan, Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, right after this. You know, as a listener to my podcast, you qualify to receive a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times. That's right, simply go to washingtontimes.com/Andy. That's washingtontimes.com/ANDY. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here he is, Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, Stephen Dinan. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Andy.
ICE counts 460 sanctuary jails, prisons in U.S. Now, these are jails or prisons that won't cooperate with ICE, and why?
So that's exactly right. This is an interesting count. It's been a long time since ICE has estimated the jurisdictions or sanctuary jurisdictions out there, and the number has grown over the Trump years. But when ICE, under the president's orders, then President Trump's orders at the beginning of his tenure, released a list of sanctuary jurisdictions, it was only about 120 or so. And so it's a major increase in the number of places and in jails, local jails that refuse to cooperate. And the reason is it's twofold. A lot of it actually is just sort of resistance to President Trump and the fact that President Trump wanted to increase immigration enforcement. One of the things that a number of communities that wanted to show that they were not with President Trump did is they embrace anti-enforcement policies or sanctuary policies, refusing to cooperate, meaning refusing to. There are two different types of sanctuaries. There are sort of extreme sanctuaries and then lesser sanctuaries. The lesser sanctuaries will still allow ICE officers to come and pick people up and may even notify them, hey, we're going to release these folks, but won't make any extra efforts to hold them and sort of limit their cooperation. The extreme sanctuaries, and those are the 460-odd fully uncooperative. There are another 150 or so that were sort of limited sanctuaries, but the 460 or full sanctuaries will not even communicate with ICE. They won't tell them when somebody's going to be released. They won't share information, and in some cases try and deny access to their own files and their own information, oftentimes with a law, a state law or a local county or city ordinance. Their logic is that they believe they're protecting the immigrant community from overzealous enforcement of federal law. And there's an argument they make that they believe that if people think that they are cooperating with ICE, that people in the immigrant community will be less likely to come forward and report crimes, therefore not getting other people off the street. So, for example, an illegal immigrant who was the victim of a domestic violence assault would be unlikely to come forward if they thought there was a chance they would end up getting turned over to ICE because they came forward. ICE says that just doesn't happen. It's a false fear. ICE goes after targets. They know who they're going after, but the local communities say, no, we still think that it's hurting our ability to enforce the law.
All right, I'm going to stay with the border area and immigration for a second. Woman escapes from Border Patrol, dies after fall from cliff. She had been caught and handcuffed? Well, how did this happen?
It's a good question. We will find out the details eventually. Border Patrol is often very slow in releasing details of investigations into death in custody. It can oftentimes take a year or longer. But so the details that we do know are it was a single agent apprehended a group of 4 people who had come across the border. He had 3 sets of handcuffs, and so he used the 3 sets of handcuffs to handcuff 4 people together, figuring that, okay, this will prevent them. They can't run away as a group of 4. Somehow, the woman managed to slip her hand out of the handcuffs and then made a run back towards the border, towards the Rio Grande. And it sounds like it must have been the Rio Grande. There must be slightly below the grade where they were, or 20 feet below the grade where they were, because she fell off a cliff 20 feet down the cliff towards the Rio Grande and sustained injuries that apparently took her life. But as you said, it's going to be interesting to see how she managed to slip her hand out of the handcuffs, and whether there was some issue with the procedures that the agent was following, or an issue with the handcuffs, or something else altogether. But this is one of those things where a lot of these deaths, a smuggler was fleeing at a high speed and crashed and killed the people in his car. There are people. There was another guy who fell off the border wall and died. So those sorts of deaths are all fairly, they're tragic, but they're straightforward. This one, a lot of questions about how somebody manages to escape handcuffs and then fall off a cliff.
Republicans demand answers over screening of Afghans brought to the U.S. Any idea the government actually knows who is here and what kind of danger they present?
Well, so they may know, but they're not doing a very good job of telling the public or even members of Congress, apparently. Secretary of Homeland Security Mayorkas did a briefing late last week and it was actually stunning how few answers there were to the big questions. He wouldn't say what the current numbers are. He gave basically repeated the broad scope of numbers that there were 20,000 or so Afghans who had reached the U.S. and that more were expected, more were overseas. Somebody had challenged him with the estimate of about 50,000 that's been Afghans eventually to reach the U.S. that have been floating around. And he said, I think it'll be more than that, but wouldn't say why or how many more. He said that the part of the reason why he didn't want to go into any numbers is because he said that they don't consider the mission of evacuating Afghans to be over yet. They're going to continue to work on the Taliban to release people who may still be in danger, basically refugees, to try and get them out of there. So it's there's so much we don't know. The key questions are vetting, and Mayorkas did confirm that they have in fact flagged people who were airlifted, evacuated from Afghanistan by the U.S. airlift effort, who after the evacuation they determined had security flags. They showed up on U.S. watch lists, and he said those folks have been are being kept at third country sites outside the U.S. and that they, if they're working through those flags, but it's almost certain that that some of them will turn out to be actual risks that they don't want to bring to the U.S. And then we don't know what happens. He said they will continue to work with other countries to try and figure out a place for them. But it's a really there's a lot we don't know, and that's really sort of more than a week after the airlift ended. And, at that point, 3.5 weeks after the airlift began, the fact that we still don't know how many people were actually lifted out in that Afghan community, what sort of categories they fall into, whether they were people who assisted the U.S. war effort, and there's a lot of support for helping them, versus just sort of, other refugee types who are fleeing fears of persecution or violence, but who didn't assist the U.S. war effort. We don't know those distinctions right now. We don't know what the internal numbers of that population are, and we don't know how many have been flagged with these security flags. What we do know is something I reported: convicted rapists and previous deportee who reached the U.S. in the middle of all this and was finally flagged at Dulles Airport. But those are the sorts of things that do raise the questions about how good the vetting is on the front end.
From Homeland Security to Social Security, COVID-19's effect on pregnancies. Usually when people were penned up, there's a baby boom. Not this case?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not a baby boom. The big question is whether there's going to be a birth dearth or not. And there had been a number of projections before suggesting a birth dearth. The Social Security, though, actually, folks who care intently about the answer to this question about birth and death, because that is what their business is those births mean future workers to support the people who haven't yet died, to be very crass about it. So they study this stuff intently, and Social Security says the births that have been deferred, the pregnancies that didn't happen last year and this year, they expect to be made up in full over from 2023 to 2026. So they say there won't be a long-term birth dearth. Congressional Budget Office actually has said they do believe there's going to be a long-term birth dearth. And there are a lot of financial implications to whether there is or isn't. But so Social Security, very important marker here, they think that births will return to normal. And in fact, this year's report actually increased their estimate for the overall fertility rate back to 2.0. They figure a decade or two, the fertility rate, which is the average number of births per woman, will be back up at 2. Right now, during the pandemic, the total fertility rate project point between 1.5 and 1.6, which is really, really low. Replacement level is 2.1 births per woman. So even at 2.0, we're not at replacement level. The population, if you didn't have any immigration, the U.S. population would gradually shrink at a fertility rate of 2.0. Right now, amid the pandemic, we're at 1.5 to 1.6. So really, really low. We'd be looking at a massive, fairly rapid decrease in population if we were to stick at that. They think we get back to 2.0.
All right. Before I let you go, what are you working on?
So it's actually on the Afghan refugees, and it's one of the really striking things about this is how much public support there is for the Afghan arrivals. You go back to, say, the Syrian refugees of the Obama era. You look at the surge of Central American migrants, many of them asylum seekers across the southwestern border, and there's not a lot of support for, first of all, bringing them here, allowing them to stay. In fact, I was looking over the numbers. It was 60% opposed Syrian refugees or surging Syrian refugees amid the crisis in that country back in 2015, 2016. But yet, when you talk about the Afghans, it's about 2/3 of the public says, yes, let them come in. We want them. We're welcoming them. The aid agencies have been overwhelmed with offers of support and donations of money, time, and in particular, supplies, everything from cooking equipment to art supplies, wall art. And they're just like, they are so thrilled with that response. And it's really striking for a country that has often been ambivalent about waves of migrants. Dating back to our founding, we've been worried, there's been wariness over waves of migrants. The enthusiasm for this one is really fascinating. And I talked to some folks who had different ideas, but it seems to boil down to most Americans, for the last 20 years, Afghanistan was in the American psyche. There are some 800,000 Americans who served over in Afghanistan over that 20-year period and have come back with connections to that country, and their families all in some way feel a connection. Plus, this was sold to us, and it's still true that some of this population were people who helped in the war effort, and there's definitely a sense that Americans feel an obligation with everything else that's gone wrong in Afghanistan in the last months or so, that we do feel an obligation to help those folks who tried to help us. And that seems to be what's going on there. Now, how long that lasts as you start seeing more stories about, like the one we did about the rapist, and more stories about the security flags that are coming across, that support may fade, and that's what we'll watch for.
Looking forward to it, and we'll read that and all of Stephen Dinan's stories at WashingtonTimes.com. Great to talk to you. Thanks, Stephen.
My pleasure, Andy.
Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, Stephen Dinan. Thanks for joining me today, and remember to receive a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times. Go to WashingtonTimes.com/Andy. You'll get 24/7 digital access to the Washington Times at 50% off. Again, go to WashingtonTimes.com/ANDY. I'm Andy Parks. Have a great day.